Sometimes the strongest man in the room is the one who says nothing after being humiliated. The sharp sound echoed across the crowded cafe so suddenly that every conversation stopped at once. Coffee cups froze halfway to waiting hands. A spoon slipped gently onto a porcelain saucer. Even the espresso machine seemed quieter for a single unforgettable moment. Ryan Walker slowly turned his head after the unexpected slap landed across his cheek, his expression remaining remarkably calm despite dozens of strangers now staring directly at him. His weathered blue work shirt, faded jeans, and worn work boots made him look like any hard-working mechanic stopping for a late afternoon coffee after a long day beneath car hoods and engine blocks. Nothing about him suggested an extraordinary past. Nothing about him invited a second glance. Yet the silence surrounding him felt heavier than the embarrassment itself. Across from him stood Claire Bennett, one of the youngest chief executive officers in the country, dressed in an elegant navy business suit that reflected the success she had spent years building. Her breathing was uneven, her face flushed with frustration after believing Ryan had deliberately interfered with an important business meeting. A folder containing confidential documents rested on the floor beside an overturned coffee cup, dark liquid slowly spreading across polished hardwood. "You should have stayed out of my way," Claire said firmly, her voice carrying through the cafe. Ryan looked briefly at the spilled coffee before quietly kneeling to gather the scattered papers one page at a time. He handled every sheet with surprising care, making certain nothing became damaged. He never raised his voice. He never defended himself. He simply placed the papers neatly back inside the folder before standing once again. "I am sorry your afternoon became more difficult," he said calmly. "That was never my intention." Several customers exchanged confused looks. They had expected anger. They had expected an argument. Instead they witnessed something far quieter, and somehow far more powerful. Claire stared at Ryan in disbelief. His response unsettled her far more than any confrontation could have. Before she could speak again, the young waitress hurried forward with visible concern. "Sir," she whispered, "this happened because you tried to stop me from dropping the tray." Ryan offered her a reassuring smile. "It is all right." The waitress lowered her eyes, clearly feeling responsible for everything that had unfolded. Ryan gently picked up the last napkin from the floor and placed it on the counter before reaching for his wallet. "Please add another coffee to my bill," he told her softly. "The fresh pot was lost because of me." Claire frowned. "You are paying for something that was not your fault." Ryan simply nodded. "Someone still has to clean it up." Those few words lingered inside the quiet cafe. Near the entrance stood Claire's personal bodyguard, former Army Ranger Daniel Brooks. Throughout the entire exchange he had remained silent, carefully observing the room with the disciplined awareness years of military service had taught him. As Ryan rolled the sleeves of his work shirt slightly higher while wiping coffee from his forearm with a paper towel, Daniel's attention locked onto a narrow scar running diagonally across Ryan's right arm. His eyes narrowed. The scar was old, precise, and strangely familiar. Ryan noticed Daniel watching him but offered only a polite nod before placing several bills beneath his untouched coffee cup and preparing to leave. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken for reasons he could not immediately explain. Somewhere deep within memories he had spent years trying to forget, that scar belonged to someone he had once believed he would never see again. As Ryan quietly walked toward the cafe door without demanding an apology, Daniel took one slow step forward, unable to look away from the scar that was beginning to unravel a story no one else inside the cafe even knew existed. Ryan Walker stepped out of the cafe without looking back, allowing the cool evening breeze to replace the heavy silence he had left behind. The fading sunlight stretched across the quiet downtown sidewalks as office workers hurried toward parking garages and subway entrances, each carrying the invisible weight of another ordinary day. Ryan blended into the crowd without effort. He preferred it that way. 10 minutes later his aging pickup truck rolled into the driveway of a modest single-story home on the edge of town. The paint on the house had faded over the years, but the flower boxes beneath the windows overflowed with bright yellow daisies carefully planted by a pair of small hands every spring. Before Ryan had completely switched off the engine, the front door flew open. "Daddy," 8-year-old Lily shouted with excitement as she ran across the yard. Ryan smiled immediately, every trace of the café disappearing from his face before she reached him. He knelt to hug her tightly. "How was school?" he asked. "I got an A on my science project," Lily answered proudly while holding up a colorful folder. Ryan studied every page as though it were the most important document in the world. "You worked hard for this," he said with genuine admiration. "I am proud of you." Lily looked up at him with innocent curiosity. "Daddy, your cheek is a little red. Did you bump into something?" Ryan gently smiled. "Just a busy afternoon." He never mentioned the café. He never mentioned Claire Bennett. Some burdens, he believed, did not belong on a child's shoulders. After dinner they drove together to Walker Auto Repair, the small neighborhood garage Ryan had owned for nearly 8 years. While he finished replacing the brakes on a customer's family sedan, Lily sat at a workbench nearby completing her homework, occasionally asking questions about math or spelling. Every answer Ryan gave carried the same patient kindness he showed every customer who entered his shop. A retired school teacher stopped by to pick up her car. "Ryan," she said warmly, "you charged me less than the estimate." Ryan simply smiled. "The replacement part lasted longer than I expected. It would not have been right to charge you for work I did not need to do." She thanked him repeatedly before driving away. Moments later a young delivery driver arrived looking embarrassed. "I cannot afford the repair until next month," he admitted quietly. Ryan looked over the truck for several minutes before closing the hood. "The problem is minor. Drive safely, and bring the payment whenever you are able." The young man stared in disbelief. "You trust me?" Ryan nodded once. Everyone deserves someone who believes them the first time. As darkness settled outside the garage, Lily finished sweeping the floor before hanging a hand-painted wooden sign above the office door. It read, "Integrity is what you do when nobody is watching." Ryan looked at the sign with quiet affection. "Your mother used to say that every morning," he whispered softly. Lily smiled. "Then we should keep remembering it." Ryan rested his hand gently on her shoulder. Through the open garage door the evening sky glowed deep orange before slowly fading into blue. Far across town, Claire Bennett sat alone in her luxury penthouse staring out at the same sunset, unable to stop replaying the image of the quiet mechanic who had answered public humiliation with dignity instead of anger. Meanwhile, inside another vehicle parked discreetly across the street from the garage, Daniel Brooks remained motionless behind the steering wheel. He had followed Ryan without being noticed, not because he suspected danger, but because the scar on Ryan's arm refused to leave his memory. Daniel opened an old leather notebook he had carried for years, turned carefully through several worn pages, and stopped at a faded photograph from a military deployment long ago. His breathing slowed as he compared the photograph with the face he had seen inside the café only hours earlier, realizing the impossible possibility growing stronger with every passing second. Claire Bennett had built her reputation on making impossible decisions without hesitation. At 34 years old, she had transformed Bennett Technologies into one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity companies in the country, earning respect inside boardrooms where confidence often mattered as much as competence. Every morning followed the same disciplined routine. Sunrise workouts. Executive briefings. Investor calls. Endless meetings. Every minute carefully scheduled, every decision measured against billion-dollar consequences. People admired her success, but very few understood its cost. The pressure never truly ended. Every smile in a conference room carried hidden expectations. Every handshake concealed another negotiation. Every headline judged her before she spoke a single word. By the time she arrived at the café that afternoon, she had already spent 12 exhausting hours managing an attempted corporate takeover, calming nervous investors, and protecting hundreds of employees whose futures depended upon her leadership. None of those burdens excused what had happened inside the café, but they explained why her patience had become dangerously thin. Sitting alone in her penthouse that evening, Claire slowly replayed the incident again and again. She could still hear the quiet voice of the mechanic saying, "I am sorry your afternoon became more difficult." The words refused to leave her mind because they contained no anger, no sarcasm, and no attempt to embarrass her in return. They simply carried kindness she had not deserved. Claire stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glowing skyline, holding an untouched cup of tea that had long since grown cold. Behind her, television news quietly reported another successful quarter for Bennett Technologies. Normally such headlines brought satisfaction. Tonight they sounded strangely empty. Her assistant, Megan Foster, entered carrying several documents for the following day's board meeting. She immediately noticed Claire staring silently across the city. "You have not reviewed tomorrow's presentation," Megan said gently. Claire nodded without turning around. "I know." Megan hesitated before asking, "Are you still thinking about what happened this afternoon?" Claire finally answered. "He never defended himself." Megan carefully chose her words. "Sometimes the strongest response is restraint." Claire lowered her eyes. Or maybe it was disappointment. The room fell quiet once again. At nearly the same moment, several miles away, Daniel Brooks remained inside his parked vehicle across from Walker Auto Repair. The faded military photograph rested on the steering wheel beneath the soft glow of the dashboard lights. 6 soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder wearing desert camouflage uniforms. One face immediately drew his attention. Younger. Leaner. Clean-shaven. But unmistakably familiar. Daniel looked back toward the garage where Ryan had just finished locking the front entrance before helping Lily into the pickup truck. Ryan laughed as his daughter excitedly described tomorrow's school field trip, completely unaware someone was quietly watching from across the street. Daniel compared the old photograph with Ryan's profile one final time before slowly closing the notebook. "It cannot be," he whispered to himself. Yet every instinct developed during years of military service told him otherwise. The posture. The calm awareness. The scar. The refusal to react under pressure. None of those qualities belonged to coincidence. Daniel started the engine but remained parked for another minute, watching Ryan drive away toward home beneath the streetlights. He knew exactly what he needed to do next. Before another sunrise arrived, he would return to military archives that had remained untouched for years, because if the quiet mechanic truly was the man from that photograph, then Claire Bennett had unknowingly humiliated someone whose story had never been told, and whose silence had hidden far more honor than anyone inside that crowded cafe could possibly imagine. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale golden sunlight that spilled across the quiet streets of the city as though nothing unusual had happened the day before. Ryan Walker unlocked the doors of Walker Auto Repair before 7 o'clock, just as he had every weekday for nearly a decade. The familiar scent of motor oil, fresh coffee, and clean steel filled the garage while the old radio softly played classic country songs that had long become part of the building itself. Lily sat in the small office finishing breakfast before school, carefully packing her science project into a backpack twice its size. Ryan smiled as he helped zip it closed. "Big presentation today," he said warmly. Lily nodded with nervous excitement. "Do you think I will remember everything?" Ryan gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "Just tell the truth. People always remember honesty." She hugged him tightly before climbing onto the school bus that stopped at the corner every morning. Ryan stood outside until the bus disappeared down the street, only then returning to the garage. Several hours later, downtown, Claire Bennett entered the executive boardroom where 12 directors waited around a polished walnut conference table. Digital screens displayed financial forecasts while assistants quietly distributed reports. Normally Claire commanded every meeting with complete confidence, but today her thoughts wandered unexpectedly back to the cafe. She barely noticed when one director asked for her opinion. "Claire," another executive repeated gently. She blinked and looked up. "I apologize. Please continue." Her assistant Megan noticed immediately. Claire had never lost focus during a board meeting before. Across town, Daniel Brooks parked outside a federal Veterans Resource Center after requesting access to archived military service records that had recently become publicly releasable through historical recognition programs. He was not searching for classified operations. He only wanted confirmation that his memory had not betrayed him. An elderly archivist placed several binders and digital records on the desk. Daniel carefully searched through photographs from overseas deployments more than 15 years earlier. Then he stopped. One official group photograph immediately caught his attention. There was no doubt now. Standing in the second row wearing desert camouflage was a younger Ryan Walker. Beneath the photograph appeared a simple caption listing names and unit assignments. Daniel slowly lowered himself into the chair, reading Ryan's name several times in complete silence. Attached to the file was a commendation summary describing extraordinary leadership under impossible conditions without revealing sensitive operational details. Daniel closed the folder carefully, his respect growing heavier with every page. He finally understood why Ryan had remained so calm inside the cafe. A man who had carried responsibilities far greater than public embarrassment would never measure his dignity by someone else's anger. That afternoon Daniel drove directly toward Walker Auto Repair instead of returning to corporate headquarters. Ryan was replacing an alternator beneath the raised hood of an old family station wagon when he noticed the familiar black sport utility vehicle entering the parking lot. He calmly set down his wrench and wiped his hands with a clean shop towel. Daniel stepped out alone, leaving the vehicle doors open behind him. For several quiet seconds neither man spoke. Finally Daniel looked directly at Ryan and said softly, "I knew I recognized that scar." Ryan remained still, his expression peaceful but guarded. "It has been a long time," Daniel continued. Ryan offered a polite nod. "Yes, it has." Daniel's voice lowered almost to a whisper. "You saved my life." The garage became completely silent except for the distant ticking sound of a cooling engine. Ryan glanced toward the family photographs hanging above his workbench before looking back at Daniel. "We all came home," he answered quietly. "That is the part that matters." Daniel lowered his eyes with deep respect, realizing the man standing before him had carried one of the greatest stories of courage imaginable without ever telling a single customer, neighbor, or friend, and he suddenly understood that Claire Bennett deserved to know exactly who she had judged without ever truly seeing. Daniel Brooks remained standing in the middle of Walker Auto Repair, his eyes fixed on Ryan Walker with the quiet respect reserved for someone who had once carried impossible responsibility without asking for recognition. Sunlight streamed through the open garage doors, reflecting from polished chrome and scattered tools while the steady ticking of a cooling engine filled the silence between them. Ryan calmly picked up a wrench and returned it to its place on the workbench before speaking again. "That deployment ended a long time ago." Daniel slowly shook his head. "Not for everyone." Ryan looked toward the framed photograph of Lily sitting beside his toolbox. "The people who came home deserve the chance to move forward." Daniel lowered his voice. "Claire Bennett deserves to know the truth." Ryan offered a faint smile. "She deserves peace more than another story." Daniel studied him carefully. "You still are not angry?" Ryan thought for a moment before answering. "Anger is heavy. I already carried enough of it years ago." Those words lingered inside the quiet garage. Daniel remembered the frightened young soldiers he had served beside and suddenly understood why Ryan had always seemed different. Leadership had never been something Ryan demanded. It had been something others naturally followed because of the calm confidence he carried into every difficult situation. Several minutes later Daniel returned to Bennett Technologies headquarters carrying only the military photograph and a copy of the publicly available commendation summary. Claire Bennett had just finished another exhausting executive meeting when Daniel knocked gently on her office door. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. Claire immediately noticed the seriousness in his expression. "Come in." Daniel placed the photograph carefully on her desk without saying a word. Claire looked down at the faded image. "Who is this?" Daniel pointed toward the younger man standing quietly in the second row. "The mechanic from the cafe." Claire looked again, disbelief slowly replacing confusion. That cannot be him. Daniel slid the commendation summary across the desk. It is. Claire read silently. The document described exceptional leadership during an overseas military operation and recognized Ryan Walker for extraordinary courage that had protected multiple service members under life-threatening conditions. Sensitive operational details had been removed, but the meaning remained unmistakable. Claire slowly looked up. He never told anyone. Daniel nodded. He refused recognition then, and he still refuses it now. Claire walked toward the window overlooking the city skyline. Why did you never mention your own military service before working for me? Daniel smiled slightly. Because Ryan taught many of us that the mission mattered more than the medals. Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment. She remembered Ryan quietly paying for the spilled coffee, apologizing for an inconvenience he had not caused, comforting the frightened waitress instead of defending himself, and leaving without asking for justice. Every memory now carried a different meaning. I judged him in less than 30 seconds, she whispered. Daniel answered gently. He spent years becoming the man you met for those 30 seconds. The office fell completely silent. Claire returned to her desk and looked once more at the photograph. The younger Ryan stood exactly as he had inside the cafe, calm, composed, almost unnoticed among the others. Yet Daniel's finger rested directly over his image. He saved my life, Daniel said quietly. If he had made one different decision that day, I would never have returned home to my family. Claire slowly folded the photograph back into its protective sleeve with both hands, treating it with the same care Ryan had shown while gathering her scattered documents inside the cafe. For the first time in many years, the title Chief Executive Officer felt strangely unimportant. She finally understood that she had measured success by influence, while the quiet mechanic had measured success by the number of people who made it safely home, and in that realization, her understanding of greatness began to change forever. The city felt different the next morning, as if something unseen had shifted beneath its surface. Inside Walker Auto Repair, Ryan Walker worked as he always did, arriving before sunrise, unlocking the garage doors, and preparing for a day of honest labor that asked nothing more from him than attention and care. Lily was already at school, leaving the space unusually quiet except for the distant hum of passing cars and the occasional metallic echo of tools being placed on steel surfaces. Ryan focused on a half-disassembled engine, his movements steady and precise, while the world beyond the garage continued its relentless pace. Across the city, Claire Bennett sat in her office long before her scheduled meetings began. The photograph Daniel Brooks had left on her desk remained in front of her, carefully placed beside the military commendation report. She had not moved it since the night before. Every few minutes her eyes returned to Ryan's face in that faded image, trying to reconcile the calm mechanic she had met with the decorated soldier described in the document. Megan Foster entered quietly carrying a tablet. The board is requesting a statement regarding yesterday's cafe incident, she said carefully. Claire did not respond immediately. Instead, she asked a question that surprised even herself. What kind of person apologizes after being humiliated for something he did not do? Megan hesitated. Someone trying to avoid conflict? Claire shook her head slowly. No. Someone who has already seen worse things than conflict. She stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city skyline. I want you to find everything you can about Ryan Walker. Not just public records. Everything. Megan nodded, slightly confused but attentive. Meanwhile, Daniel Brooks returned to Walker Auto Repair alone. He parked across the street and watched the garage for several minutes before finally crossing the road. Ryan was tightening bolts beneath a lifted vehicle when Daniel stepped inside. Without looking up, Ryan said calmly, "You are early today." Daniel smiled faintly. "I did not come as security this time." Ryan rolled out from beneath the car and stood. "Then why did you come?" Daniel reached into his jacket and placed a small military insignia on the workbench. "Because there are people who would like to thank you properly if you ever allowed it." Ryan glanced at the insignia but did not pick it up. "I did not do what I did for recognition." Daniel nodded. I know. A pause followed, filled only by the quiet ticking of cooling metal. Daniel finally spoke again. Claire is going to come here. Ryan exhaled slowly but showed no surprise. She does not need to. Daniel looked at him directly. She thinks she understands you now. Ryan tightened a nearby tool on the workbench before answering. People do not understand me quickly. That afternoon Claire Bennett left her penthouse without a motorcade for the first time in years. She wore a simple coat instead of her usual tailored executive attire, as if preparing to meet someone who would not care about her title. The drive across the city felt longer than usual. Every traffic light gave her more time to think about the cafe, the silence that followed her actions, and the way Ryan had never tried to defend himself. When she finally arrived at Walker Auto Repair, she hesitated before stepping out of the car. The garage looked unchanged from the outside. Worn, modest, unremarkable. Yet she now understood that appearances meant very little. Ryan noticed her presence before she spoke. He wiped his hands on a cloth and greeted her with the same calm expression he had always shown. You did not need to come here, he said gently. Claire stepped closer. I needed to understand something I have spent my entire life overlooking. Ryan waited. Claire looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. I am sorry. The words were simple but carried the weight of everything she had learned over the past 2 days. Ryan nodded once. Then you understand more than most people do already. Claire looked around the garage, noticing Lily's drawings, the family photographs, the handwritten notes from grateful customers, and the quiet order of a life built on consistency rather than recognition. What happens now? She asked softly. Ryan glanced toward the open garage door where sunlight spilled across the floor. Now you decide what kind of impact you want to leave behind. Claire followed his gaze and realized for the first time that influence without integrity meant nothing at all, and that the quiet man standing in front of her had already built a legacy far greater than anything she had ever achieved in a boardroom. Claire Bennett remained inside Walker Auto Repair long after her apology had been accepted. Neither she nor Ryan Walker seemed interested in ending the conversation quickly. Outside, the afternoon sun settled lower across the neighborhood, casting long golden reflections through the open garage doors while the quiet sounds of passing traffic blended with the rhythmic turning of a socket wrench. Ryan returned to the family sedan waiting on the lift, tightening the final bolts with the same concentration he had given every customer for years. Claire watched silently, realizing that even after everything she had learned, he had not changed his routine by a single minute. Success had never altered him because recognition had never been his destination. May I ask you something? She finally said. Ryan lowered the hood of the vehicle and nodded. Of course. Claire hesitated. Why did you leave the military if you were so respected? Ryan remained quiet for several seconds before answering. Because one day I realized my daughter deserved to know her father more than the country needed another deployment. Claire lowered her eyes. There was no bitterness in his voice, only peace with a difficult decision. Do you ever miss it? She asked. Ryan smiled faintly. I miss the people. I do not miss the distance from home. Before Claire could respond, the bell above the office door rang softly as an elderly man entered carrying the keys to an aging pickup truck. Ryan, he called warmly, I think the old transmission is finally giving up. Ryan immediately walked over with the same welcoming smile he offered everyone. Let us take a look. The elderly customer noticed Claire standing nearby and recognized her instantly from business magazines. His eyes widened for only a moment before returning to Ryan. I hope I am not interrupting anything important. Ryan shook his head. Helping you is important. Claire quietly stepped aside while Ryan carefully listened to every concern the customer described, never rushing him, never looking impatient despite the conversation taking several minutes. When the inspection ended, Ryan explained the repairs in simple language without recommending unnecessary work. You still have some time before replacing the transmission, he said honestly. For now, a fluid service should keep everything running well. The elderly man smiled with visible relief. Most shops would have sold me a whole new transmission. Ryan shrugged gently. You only replace what actually needs replacing. After the customer left, Claire looked at Ryan with growing admiration. You run this garage the same way you lived your military career. Ryan looked slightly surprised. How do you know that? Claire smiled softly. Daniel told me enough to understand that you always protected people first. At that moment Daniel Brooks entered carrying a small cardboard box. He placed it carefully on the office desk before opening it. Inside rested several faded photographs from years earlier, each showing members of the same military unit smiling between deployments. Daniel picked up one picture and handed it to Claire. Ryan stood quietly in the background, laughing beside several teammates during a rare peaceful afternoon overseas. He was always the last one to eat, Daniel said. He always checked on everyone else first. Ryan looked embarrassed by the attention. We all looked after each other. Daniel shook his head. No. You looked after all of us. Claire studied the photograph before placing it back inside the box with great care. The image revealed something no corporate award or executive biography ever could. Greatness was not measured by titles. It was measured by the people whose lives quietly became better because one person chose responsibility over recognition. As evening settled over the garage once again, Lily returned from school carrying her science project ribbon and ran happily toward her father. Ryan knelt to congratulate her with genuine excitement, completely forgetting that one of the country's most influential chief executive officers was standing only a few feet away. Claire watched father and daughter embrace beneath the warm light spilling through the garage doors and finally understood that the greatest achievement Ryan Walker had ever earned was not hidden inside military records or forgotten commendations. It was the simple trust shining in his daughter's eyes every time she called him Dad. Ironically, the moment Claire Bennett stopped trying to impress the world was the moment she finally began earning its respect. The days that followed passed quietly, yet something fundamental had changed inside her. She still led Bennett Technologies with confidence, but now she listened longer before speaking, thanked employees whose names she had never learned before, and discovered that leadership felt lighter when pride no longer carried its full weight. Megan Foster noticed the difference almost immediately. During one executive meeting, a junior engineer nervously admitted that a costly software delay had resulted from his own mistake. The conference room became perfectly still as everyone waited for Claire's response. Only a week earlier, she might have reacted with visible frustration. Instead, she calmly closed the presentation folder and asked, "Tell us what you learned, and tell us how we prevent it from happening again." The young engineer looked stunned. The atmosphere inside the room changed in an instant. Accountability replaced fear. After the meeting ended, Megan quietly smiled. Someone has been teaching you. Claire looked toward the window overlooking the city skyline. No, she answered softly. Someone reminded me who I should have been all along. Meanwhile, life at Walker Auto Repair continued with its familiar rhythm. Ryan Walker greeted every customer with the same quiet patience, never mentioning the unexpected attention surrounding his past. Word had slowly spread through the neighborhood, not because Ryan had spoken about himself, but because Daniel Brooks had privately shared his admiration with several local veterans. Soon former service members occasionally stopped by the garage, not seeking stories of military service, but simply wanting to shake Ryan's hand. Ryan welcomed each visitor with warmth before guiding the conversation toward their families, their health, or their future plans. He seemed determined that every reunion focus on life ahead instead of memories behind. One Saturday morning, Lily helped organize donated school supplies that customers had quietly begun leaving inside the office. Boxes of notebooks, backpacks, pencils, and children's books filled one corner of the garage. "Why are people bringing all these things?" Lily asked. Ryan smiled while stacking another carton. "Because kindness grows when someone chooses to begin it." Claire arrived unexpectedly a few minutes later, driving herself without assistance or security vehicles. She carried several plain cardboard boxes instead of expensive gift baskets. Lily immediately opened one and discovered brand new science kits, art supplies, and children's educational books. Her eyes widened with excitement. "These are amazing." Claire smiled gently. "I thought they might help the neighborhood children." Ryan looked at the boxes before meeting Claire's eyes. "You did not have to do this." Claire answered honestly. "I wanted to." Daniel arrived soon afterward carrying coffee for everyone. As the four of them stood inside the garage sharing a quiet morning conversation, several neighborhood families began arriving to pick up repaired vehicles. Without anyone planning it, the garage slowly transformed into something much larger than a repair shop. Parents exchanged advice. Veterans introduced themselves to one another. Children laughed while drawing colorful pictures beside Lily. An elderly widow delivered homemade cookies simply to thank Ryan for fixing her late husband's truck months earlier. Claire observed every interaction carefully. Nobody cared that she was a chief executive officer. Nobody asked Ryan about military commendations. Titles disappeared the moment genuine character entered the room. Before leaving, Claire walked toward the handwritten sign hanging above the office door. "Integrity is what you do when nobody is watching." She read the words slowly before turning toward Ryan. "I used to believe success meant building the biggest company." Ryan folded a clean shop towel and placed it neatly on the workbench. "And now?" Claire asked herself the question almost aloud before answering. "Now I think success is building the kind of place where people feel safe enough to become their best selves." Ryan nodded quietly. "That is the kind of work that lasts." As sunlight poured through the open garage doors, illuminating smiling families, hardworking neighbors, and children dreaming about brighter futures, Claire realized the greatest investment she would ever make would never appear on a financial statement. It would live instead inside ordinary people whose lives quietly changed because one humble mechanic had chosen dignity over resentment, grace over pride, and service over recognition. The morning air above Walker Auto Repair carried a sense of quiet completion, as if the world itself had finally settled after a long series of misunderstandings, revelations, and silent transformations. Ryan Walker stood near the open garage door with Lily beside him, both of them watching the neighborhood slowly come alive in the soft golden light of sunrise. Inside the garage, the familiar sounds of tools, distant engines, and early customers created a rhythm that felt unchanged on the surface, yet everything beneath it had shifted in ways no one could easily explain. Claire Bennett arrived a few minutes later without announcement, stepping out of a simple black car instead of her usual executive vehicle. She paused briefly before entering, as though acknowledging that she was crossing into a space that no longer belonged to hierarchy or titles. In her hand she carried a single envelope. Ryan noticed her immediately but did not interrupt the moment she seemed to be gathering courage. Daniel Brooks stood near the workbench, observing quietly without speaking. Claire approached Ryan slowly and placed the envelope on the counter. "This is not business-related," she said softly. Ryan looked at it without opening it. "Then it does not need to be urgent." Claire nodded, almost relieved by his response. Inside the envelope was a formal proposal for a foundation under Bennett Technologies, but rewritten completely to reflect something she had never previously considered: not expansion, not profit, but restoration. Job training programs for veterans. Support for single parents rebuilding their lives. Community repair centers modeled after Walker Auto Repair. Ryan finally opened the envelope, scanned the pages briefly, then set it down again. "You do not need my approval for this," he said calmly. Claire shook her head. "I do if I want it to mean something real." Lily looked up from the small desk where she was drawing. "Is this about helping people like Daddy helps people?" Claire smiled gently. "Yes, exactly like that." Daniel stepped forward for the first time. "She is serious," he said. "I have seen a lot of corporate promises in my career. This one feels different." Ryan remained silent for a moment, then spoke with quiet certainty. "If you build it for the right reasons, it will survive challenges you cannot predict yet." Claire absorbed his words carefully. "And if I make mistakes?" Ryan answered without hesitation. "Then you correct them, the same way you corrected yesterday." A soft silence followed, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Outside, customers continued arriving, unaware they were witnessing the early formation of something larger than a repair shop or a business initiative. A mother came in with a broken stroller wheel. An elderly veteran stopped by simply to say thank you again. A teenage boy asked if he could learn how to fix engines after school. Each interaction added another quiet layer to what was becoming a community without needing a name. Claire watched everything carefully, realizing she had spent years measuring success through numbers, valuations, and market influence, while Ryan had been measuring it through repaired engines, stable families, and people who left his presence slightly more hopeful than when they arrived. Before leaving that afternoon, Claire stood once more near the garage entrance. "I used to think leadership was about being in control," she said honestly. Ryan leaned against a nearby workbench, wiping his hands with a clean cloth. "And now?" Claire looked at the people moving peacefully through the garage, at Lily helping organize tools, at Daniel quietly assisting a customer, at Ryan himself standing without needing recognition. "Now I think leadership is about what remains when you are not trying to lead at all." Ryan nodded once, as if that answer required no further explanation. Claire turned to leave but paused one final moment. "Thank you," she said. Ryan responded simply, "For what?" Claire smiled faintly. "For not becoming what the world expected you to become." As her car disappeared down the street, the garage returned to its steady rhythm. But something irreversible had already taken place. Not a public victory, not a dramatic transformation, but a quiet alignment of purpose among people who had finally learned to see value where they once saw nothing at all. And in that ordinary morning light, Walker Auto Repair no longer felt like just a place where machines were fixed, but like the beginning of something far more enduring, built not on power or reputation, but on the simple decision to treat every person as if their story still mattered.